Hey guys, tonight we slip into the dry silence of the Persian desert, where the wind whispers like a memory and the stars blink down over clay domes older than most languages still spoken. You're standing at the edge of the city of Yazd, around the year founded BCE, wrapped in a woven shawl and squinting into the dusk. The sun has dipped behind the jagged mountains, but the heat still clings to the ground like gossip in a tea house. Out here, in the middle of this moonlit nothingness, you're heading toward something strange, something you probably won't survive in modern clothes and flip-flops. Towering in front of you like a quiet spaceship from a civilization of potters, the yakhchal rises from the desert floor. It's a massive dome, taller than a 3-story building, built entirely from mud, straw, and sheer stubbornness. There's no light inside, no humming machines, just the scent of dust, the faint echo of your sandals, and an eerie breath of cold air seeping from a slit in the base. You step closer, peering in, wondering how on earth, how in this oven of a landscape, anyone could have made ice, let alone preserved it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments if you want. I love seeing where everyone's drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You duck your head, shuffle sideways into the passage, and feel the temperature drop. Not dramatically, this isn't a movie, but noticeably. The floor beneath you is hard-packed earth, worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic. Your fingers brush the wall. It's rough, cool. There's a tiny bit of moisture clinging to the clay, as if the building itself is exhaling a frozen sigh from winters long past. This, right here, is a feat of ancient engineering that feels almost like cheating. No electricity, no plastic, just pure geometry, physics, and a society absolutely unwilling to give up their cold drinks in July. You can't blame them. Imagine trying to throw a royal banquet in 110-degree heat with nothing but lukewarm pomegranate juice. Even Cyrus the Great wouldn't have smiled through that. The yakhchal, literally ice pit, was Persia's answer to refrigeration. Part storage unit, part science project, part communal miracle. It began with a clever use of climate. Winters in much of ancient Persia could be cold, especially at night. Not Siberia cold, but enough to freeze shallow pools of water. The trick was to catch that chill and bottle it, or more precisely, brick it in. So outside cities like Yazd and Kerman, Persians dug long, shallow trenches lined with dark stone. These would fill with water overnight, and when the temperature dropped below freezing, a thin crust of ice would form. That's your basic freezer, Bronze Age edition. But collecting a bit of frost isn't enough. They needed a place to stash the goods. Enter the yakhchal itself, a towering dome built from a special mortar called saruj. Think of it as the duct tape of the ancient world. It was a mix of sand, clay, lime, egg whites, yes, seriously, goat hair, and ash. The result? A material waterproof, heat-resistant, and apparently goat-approved. You run your hand along the inside again. That wall, it's about 2 meters thick at the base. Insulation like a fortress. No wonder some of these structures are still standing. There are modern Airbnbs that wouldn't last this long. You ease deeper into the chamber. The light from outside fades, and your steps grow cautious. It's darker in here than you expect, but the coolness is undeniable. Somewhere beneath your feet, sometimes as deep as 5 meters below ground, there would have been a wide storage pit where the winter ice was stacked, slabs layered between straw, like an icy baklava, to keep them from melting into a seasonal soup. And the best part, they worked. These ancient freezers could preserve ice from the dead of winter all the way into the brutal summer, when water was scarce and tempers were shorter than a tax collector's patience. Historians still argue whether every town had access to a yakhchal, or whether they were reserved for wealthier regions or royal supply lines. Some insist they were elite luxuries. Others argue they served broader communities, storing not just ice, but food, dairy, and even corpses on especially unlucky market days. We may never know the full story. You lean against the wall and close your eyes. For a second, you can almost hear them. Workers dragging blocks of ice through the narrow passage, their footsteps muffled by layers of straw. Maybe there's a merchant outside arguing about who gets how many slivers for their fruit stall. Maybe a little boy is sneaking a shard to crunch behind a camel cart. In a world where even cold water was a seasonal privilege, this place must have felt like a miracle, or at least a really excellent loophole. And maybe that's the whole lesson of the yakhchal. Humans will always find a way to stay cool, even if it takes goat hair, ash, and egg whites to do it. Especially if dessert's on the line, you sit in the cool shadows of the yakhchal a while longer, your eyes adjusting to the gloom as your thoughts drift outward, backward. You wonder, how did they even begin to come up with this? Who looked at a sun-scorched landscape and thought, "Yep, ice, right here, under this broiling sky"? The answer, like most great ideas, probably started out very humbly, and possibly with a little desperation. To get there, you'll need to rewind about 3,000 years, to the early days of the Achaemenid Empire. This is where Persian ingenuity first began laying the groundwork, not just for massive stone palaces or immortal armies, but for climate control with mud and math. Because it turns out when you're surrounded by desert, and your king likes his rosewater chilled, necessity doesn't just birth invention. It practically kidnaps it and demands a solution before dinner. You picture an early farmer, maybe somewhere near the Zagros foothills, noticing that water left in a shallow, shaded depression freezes more quickly than water in a deeper one. Maybe they noticed that it froze better when it was windless. Maybe their goat accidentally kicked over a pot of milk, and they realized that in the morning the top had formed a crunchy little skin of frost. Milk sickles by mistake. Historians still argue whether the earliest yakhchals were designed solely for ice, or whether they first began as grain storage domes, repurposed later when winter surprises started showing up in their water troughs. Some evidence suggests that the Persians may have borrowed techniques from earlier Mesopotamian cooling structures. Others say no, it was purely a local innovation, born from the perfect blend of climate, need, and just enough egg white. So how exactly did they get from cold water is nice to let's build a 60-foot heat-proof igloo? The first ingredient was understanding temperature inversion, not in a lab coat, equations on a chalkboard way, but intuitively. Cold air sinks. So if you build a tall dome with a narrow opening and deep base, the cold air inside tends to settle and stay there, especially when protected by thick insulating walls. Add in the lack of direct sunlight, and you have yourself a Bronze Age refrigerator that works surprisingly well. Of course, it wasn't just about building the dome. It was about everything around it. You needed wind catchers, those tall, narrow towers called yakhchals that looked like decorative chimneys. But they weren't for smoke. They were for wind. When aligned with the prevailing breezes, these towers would channel cool air down into the yakhchal and let warm air rise and escape. Natural ventilation that made the whole interior a few blessed degrees cooler than the outside. Sometimes, these yakhchals weren't even attached directly to the yakhchal, but worked in tandem with underground canals called qanats. These were subterranean aqueducts that brought water from distant mountain springs down into the city through gently sloping tunnels. The water stayed cool thanks to the shade of the earth, and some of it could be diverted beneath the yakhchal itself, further helping to drop the temperature and encourage freezing. Yes, it's a lot of moving parts for a civilization without mechanical refrigeration. But then again, you have a smartphone that can order noodles from a satellite, so maybe we shouldn't judge too quickly. Now picture this. In the dead of a cold Persian night, teams of workers carefully filling the long, shallow pools outside the dome. They'd wait for the freezing temperatures to do their work, then come back just before dawn with chisels and woven baskets, hauling the newborn ice into the belly of the dome before the morning sun woke up and ruined everything. Layer by layer, they'd stack the ice, sometimes sprinkling straw between layers to slow the melt. Then they'd seal the dome's mouth with thick doors, sometimes double-layered wood and felt, sometimes stone. No blinking LEDs, no humming, just darkness, patience, and architectural brilliance. And the result, ice that could last well into the sweltering heart of summer. What's particularly wild is how quiet this technology remained for centuries. Other civilizations had their cooling methods, sure. Egyptians storing water in porous jars that evaporated. Greeks experimenting with snow pits in the mountains. But the Persians took it to a whole other level, almost literally given how tall some of these domes were. And yet, despite how successful and widespread they were, the yakhchals stayed relatively unknown outside the Persian cultural sphere for a long time. It's like they had this little secret ice club going, and they weren't handing out flyers. Or maybe it's just that no one else thought a mud dome in the desert was worth investigating. You smile at the thought. Somewhere, an ancient Persian architect is probably rolling their eyes across time, muttering, "I told you it was genius." There's even a quirky little tidbit buried in the historical record. An account of a royal Persian wedding where guests were served saffron-flavored ice chips in crystal dishes, 1,000 miles from the nearest snowcap. And while historians still argue whether that detail was poetic embellishment or actual logistical insanity, it's not entirely impossible. Not if you had a yakhchal or two along the caravan route and some patient camels who didn't ask questions. So here you are, still leaning against a curved wall that's seen empires rise and fall, armies march past, and generations of local kids sneak in to see if there's still a crumb of ice to crunch in the middle of July. You take a slow breath, and it smells, oddly, like clay, straw, and the faintest whiff of ancient logistics. Kind of like a Home Depot, if it were run by a time traveler. It's humbling, calming, and a little bit absurd, but mostly it's just cool. You press your palm to the inner wall again, half expecting to feel a ghost of cold, still clinging to the bricks. But of course, it's long gone. Any ice that once lived here has probably been puddles for centuries. Still, the structure itself whispers persistence, like it's waiting for someone to bring back the old ways. a few water basins, a couple of cold nights, and voila, a party cooler that doesn't require electricity or instructions in 6 languages. But let's pull back from the dome now, drift upward like the warm air that used to escape through its vents. Because as impressive as the yakhchal is, it didn't stand alone. It was just one piece in a sophisticated Persian ecosystem of water management. And that ecosystem, it's kind of the secret sauce of how you even get ice in a desert in the first place. So you float gently now above a network of qanats, those clever underground channels. Picture this, a line of evenly spaced holes stretching across the hills like a trail of breadcrumbs, each one descending ever so slightly lower than the last. From above, it's almost hypnotic. But underneath, that's where the magic happens. Each qanat is a sloped tunnel, hand-dug with eerie precision, that guides fresh water from mountain aquifers into the city. And unlike surface rivers that lose water to evaporation, the qanat's shade keeps it cool, protected, and reliable, even through brutal summers. One mainstream historical fact: some qanats in Iran still function after over 2,000 years of continuous use. Try getting that kind of longevity from a water filter cartridge. Of course, historians still argue whether the Persians invented the qanat system independently or adapted it from earlier Mesopotamian or even Harappan practices. What we do know is that by the 5th century BCE, the system had become so refined that entire cities like Yazd could exist where there were no rivers at all. Just cool earth, clever math, and more patience than most of us can summon while waiting for our coffee to cool. You imagine being one of the diggers, down there in the tunnel, shoulder deep in the dirt, trusting only a knotted rope and the measured slope of your tiny lantern-lit world. Maybe you even sing as you work, not for fun necessarily, but because the acoustics help you judge distance and direction, and also because it's better than listening to your knees complain. But the qanats didn't just deliver water, they set the stage for other cooling tricks too, like underground cisterns with air shafts that fed cooler breezes into homes, or gardens laid out along the flow so that even your pomegranates got to enjoy the benefits of Bronze Age plumbing. And most notably, they helped feed the shallow ice pools outside the yakhchals. Those pools weren't just slapped together, by the way. They were designed with intent, wide, shallow, and oriented to minimize sun exposure and maximize freezing potential. You picture teams of workers smoothing the earth, adding reeds and mud to create insulation, and maybe someone's kid standing nearby, barefoot and unimpressed, wondering why they can't just eat the ice now. There's a fringe theory, and let's be clear, it's a fringe theory, that some of these water systems weren't just practical, but also symbolic, that the layout of water routes mirrored celestial patterns, aligning with the stars or solstice markers. Some claim the Persians saw water not just as a resource, but as a cosmic thread connecting earth and sky. Beautiful if true, a little woo-woo if not. Still, even skeptics agree that the meticulousness with which they designed their aquifers borders on spiritual. One of the odder footnotes in the ancient Persian water saga. There's at least one record of a royal engineer who was buried with a scaled-down model of a qanat. Many shafts, many tunnels, the whole thing. Like some people get cremated with their golf clubs, this guy took hydrology into the afterlife. It's moments like this where you realize just how profoundly water, and by extension, cold, shaped the Persian imagination. It wasn't just about survival. It was about prestige, ritual, architecture, And yes, a certain degree of showing off, because when you live in a desert and you can casually offer guests a chilled pomegranate sorbet, that's not just hospitality, that's theater. The deeper you wander into this desert society's cooling tech, the more it feels like wandering through a kind of ancient server room. Quiet, humming, redundant systems, all working in unison to achieve one goal: keep it cool, literally and socially. Even modern architects still study Persian water systems to understand passive cooling, sustainable design, and how to make buildings that don't need to blast AC like it's an Olympic sport. If you've ever walked into a thick-walled mud brick home and sighed in relief at the sudden drop in temperature, you've tasted a whisper of this ancient science, minus the domed headgear and pickaxe. And what really sticks with you isn't just the cleverness, it's the patience. Today, we want our drinks chilled in 5 seconds, and our air at exactly 72 degrees. But back then, people planned for seasons ahead. They laid tunnels that would take months to build just to coax a trickle of water into town. They waited for frost to form overnight so they could chip it, layer it, store it, all so that 3 months later, someone important could sip on an icy rosewater tonic without even thinking about the army of sand-dusted laborers who made it possible. You step away now from the Connaught's edge, where a faint current still runs beneath your feet. You can almost hear the soft gurgle, smell the dampness rising through cracked earth. And once again, it feels like magic. But magic that's been engineered, blueprinted, and handed down like a family recipe for cold air. The breeze is shifting now, drifting in from the west with a little more weight to it. Cooler, denser, as if the air itself remembers what it used to be, as if the wind is tugging you toward something deeper. So you follow, stepping over uneven stones, past half-buried shards of pottery, until you come upon another remnant of ancient genius, a structure that looks more like a fortress wall than part of a refrigeration system. But then you notice the angle, the curve, the placement, and you realize this isn't just architecture, it's shade on command. It's science, made of brick. You're standing before an ice wall, or rather the remains of one. In the desert, these walls weren't just there to mark territory. They were part of the freezing equation, strategically placed to cast long shadows across shallow ice pools during the coldest part of the night. You squint against the low sun, imagining how the winter light would have moved across the sky, and how every brick in this wall had a purpose, not just a wall, an instrument in a quiet symphony of survival. One mainstream historical fact: these ice walls were often aligned east to west, maximizing shadow at night and sheltering water from the morning sun. Not a coincidence. It's temperature choreography. And the Persians were, if nothing else, great choreographers of the invisible. But here's the thing that really tickles your imagination. Some of the more fringe studies suggest that, during especially harsh winters, workers would line the base of the wall with straw mats and pottery shards to encourage faster freezing, like giving the desert a helping hand in making frost. Whether it worked, historians still argue whether the materials accelerated ice formation or were simply there to insulate what little froze. And yes, you're probably imagining it right. Teams of workers huddled together, stamping straw flat with cold-numbed feet, shouting half-jokes to keep spirits up. Someone probably mutters that next time they're moving to the coast and making a living selling shell necklaces instead. But they do it anyway. Because if it works, if the water freezes even a centimeter thicker, that's a few extra cups of chilled drink later. maybe even a slice of preserved fish that doesn't reek by lunchtime. Victory, in the smallest of forms. And when the ice finally forms, thin sheets at first, delicate and glassy, they move fast. No slow motion harvesting here. They're up before sunrise, crouched in sliding blades under the fragile layer, stacking the shards into woven baskets lined with clay and straw. And here's your quirky detail for this section. In some regions, the workers didn't just store the ice. They seasoned it. Yup. They'd sprinkle in rose petals, crushed mint, or even saffron threads, so that when the blocks were finally brought out months later, they didn't just cool the palate, they seduced it. Imagine biting into a frozen delicacy laced with saffron after walking through 3 hours of sun-baked market chaos. That's not just refreshment, that's a miracle in every crunchy, fragrant shard. The Persian elite, of course, had first dibs on this miracle. Their gardens, known as paradises in Old Persian, from which the English word descends, weren't just lush and serene. They were designed to be oases in every sense, complete with pools where ice was served alongside melon slices and honeyed almonds. You picture reclining under a cedar awning, one sandal dangling lazily off your toes, while a servant with incredible posture hands you a chilled drink so delicate it could be perfume. But not all ice stayed in the palace. Some made its way to the bathhouses, where it was used to cool heated marble, balance the temperature of pools, or offer a post-steam face splash that had the punch of a cold water plunge without the drama of diving in. Now, whether that much ice could be produced consistently is, let's just say, still up for debate. Scholars argue about the real volume of ice that ancient Persians could store using their techniques. Some claim it was enough to last through half the summer. Others believe it was more of a luxury used sparingly, more ceremonial than practical. Either way, the idea that people in an arid zone thought, you know what this place needs, frozen water, and then went out and made it happen. That's audacity worth admiring. And while you're admiring, notice the geometry again. The way all these systems, walls, pools, domes, connect in precise lines and curves, like part of a vast geometric puzzle. Ancient Persian architects weren't just bricklayers. They were mathematicians with mud under their fingernails. Every angle, every shadow, every slope had a reason. The past, it seems, had no room for accidental brilliance. By now the moon is rising, brushing the tips of distant hills with silver. It gives the old wall before you a glow, as if the stones themselves are sighing with memory. You lean against the crumbling surface, half expecting to hear echoes of frost being chipped, of saffron ice being weighed and debated like it's gold. But instead, you hear nothing, just wind, low and steady. The same wind that once cooled sweat-drenched workers and scattered petals across ice beds. The same wind that once slipped between domes and ducts and told an entire city it was time to sleep. You step away, your breath slow and even, and in the distance, you swear you can still see it. One last cart, loaded with ice wrapped in reed mats, rolling through the night toward the city center. And someone, maybe half asleep, reaching for it with a drowsy smile. You keep walking, slowly now, following the faint crunch of gravel under your sandals, if you're still wearing them. The wind's doing that thing again, where it brushes just enough dust off the surface to make you squint and feel heroic, like some half-retired adventurer stumbling across the forgotten blueprints of ancient refrigeration, which, let's face it, is kind of what you're doing. You crest a small hill, more of a sandy bump, really, and below you is a shallow depression in the land. At first glance, it looks like a collapsed amphitheater or a poorly maintained garden plot, but then your eyes trace the circular lines, the sunken walls, and finally, the faint impressions of grooves leading away from it. This, my friend, is where the magic happened. A yakhchal, an ancient Persian ice pit. And no, not a metaphor, an actual pit, often topped with a conical dome that looks like a beehive mated with a minaret. These domes, built from an incredibly insulating mortar called saruj, a magical-sounding mix of sand, clay, lime, egg whites, goat hair, and ashes, were engineering marvels. Not just passive storage. No, these bad boys worked actively to keep ice from melting for months. Inside the dome, the walls curved up like the belly of a sleeping whale, while the base sank below ground to depths where the temperature could stay mercifully chilly, even during 110-degree heat wave. The mainstream historical fact here is that these yakhchals were typically 10 to 15 meters deep and could preserve ice from the dead of winter all the way through the sweltering Persian summer. And they weren't just storing. These structures were part of the greater cooling system, the final silent sentinels standing guard over the season's frozen treasure. You picture it now. Workers sliding the harvested ice down a narrow ramp into the yawning mouth of the yakhchal, each load stacked with obsessive precision, alternating with layers of straw, reeds, or even sawdust to create barriers and limit melting. The interior was kept cool, not just by the insulation, but by airflow. Clever little vents up high and down low that played tag with the desert breeze, pulling warm air out and letting cooler air sink in. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some yakhchals were used not just for ice, but for keeping fruits, cheese, and yes, fermented camel milk cool. If that doesn't scream summer picnic in the Achaemenid Empire, I don't know what does. Some scholars even believe these domes doubled as occasional chill-out rooms, literal chill-out rooms, where the upper classes could sit, sip, and dramatically declare how oppressive the heat had become. And here's where historians begin to fidget in their robes. There's ongoing debate about whether the Persians built yakhchals purely for function, or whether the design carried spiritual symbolism. The domes mirror Zoroastrian fire temples in shape, and some argue that preserving ice, this fleeting delicate substance, was a metaphor for preserving purity, order, or even the favor of Ahura Mazda, their main deity. Historians still argue whether yakhchals were sacred, secular, or somewhere sneakily in between. You step inside one in your mind. The air is heavy, but not unpleasant. Smells faintly of dust, clay, and something colder than scent usually allows. Your breath comes out in a puff, though it's not winter. That's how good the insulation is. You half expect to find an ancient thermos or maybe the very first prototype of a popsicle wrapper down there. You don't. You do, however, imagine sitting in the corner, back against the curve of the wall, sipping something cold, and listening to the walls whisper secrets. The thing is, the yakhchal wasn't isolated. It was part of a network. You remember the aqueducts from earlier? Some of those flowed directly into freezing basins in front of the yakhchals. The builders used evaporation, shade, and elevation to drop the water's temperature before it ever reached the dome. It's not just engineering. It's cold chain logistics, 500 BCE style. And it wasn't a solo job. Constructing and maintaining a yakhchal required a team, masons with nerves of steel and sunburned necks, straw gatherers with permanent hay in their hair, and perhaps some poor intern who always got assigned to ice ramp smoothing. Picture that guy, probably named Arash or Farhad, perpetually brushing gravel down the slope with the resigned patience of someone who just wants to invent indoor plumbing already. You wonder if people brought their kids to see the first batch of ice slide into the yakhchal each winter, like some kind of seasonal celebration, the ancient equivalent of watching the Rockefeller tree lighting, except colder and with more goat hair in the building materials. Some of these domes still stand, by the way, cracked, patched, leaning like they've just had a long nap. But they endure. In places like Yazd and Kerman, their pale curves catch the sun like old bones, their interiors cooler than the air outside even now. You can visit them. You probably won't, but still, it's nice to know they're out there, waiting. And maybe, in a way, they always were. Because long before you arrived, before asphalt and air conditioning and cans of soda so cold they hurt your teeth, there was this dome, and beneath it a pool of silence, broken only by the crackle of ice, a breath drawn in wonder, and the low hum of wind through the vents. You turn away, stepping lightly now. There's something reverent about a yakhchal, something that demands you walk softer, like the very ground remembers what it was like to cradle winter in a bowl of clay as you leave the yakhchal behind. Your sandals, or bare feet, no judgment, carry you toward a flatter patch of desert. The terrain shifts slightly, less dusty now, more pebbled, with a scattering of low-lying thorn bushes that seem to whisper among themselves. You picture yourself walking, not just across a landscape, but across time, each step brushing against a footprint left thousands of years ago by someone carrying a jug, or maybe hauling a stubborn goat who didn't care for refrigeration innovation. Ahead lies something that at first seems underwhelming, a shallow rectangular depression lined with smooth clay. It doesn't look like much, really. Kind of like someone tried to build a kiddie pool and gave up halfway through. But this, you soon realize, was part of the Persian deep freeze operation, the freezing basins. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In ancient Persia, these basins, shallow, wide, and strategically placed, were designed to freeze water overnight during the coldest months. They weren't decorative. They were science. Cold desert nights dropped temperatures enough to freeze standing water, especially if that water sat still and shallow in a carefully smoothed out clay pool. The people who built these basins were playing a long game. During the day, water would be diverted from qanats, those underground aqueducts we tiptoed past earlier, and left to settle into the basins. At night, the still air and clear skies would encourage radiant heat loss, and the water would slowly, quietly freeze. Come morning, chunks of ice were scraped up and dragged away to the yakhchals we just visited. You picture a man, let's call him Daryush, kneeling by the basin at dawn, his breath fogging the air, his fingers testing the ice with practiced calm. He knows exactly when it's solid enough to harvest, but not so thick that it resists the shovel. There's a rhythm to this work, a daily meditation of freeze and retrieve. Now for a quirky detail. Sometimes they poured a very thin layer of water at sunset, almost paint-like, so it would freeze faster and in manageable sheets. These thin layers could be broken into tiles of ice and stacked, like a prehistoric version of Tupperware. And yes, at some point someone probably tried skating on it. Probably fell, probably pretended it was on purpose. But there's a wrinkle, because isn't there always? Historians still argue whether these basins were primarily used for ice production or whether they began as water storage structures adapted over time. Some argue that freezing water in shallow basins was a happy accident that got turned into standard practice. Others think it was deliberate all along, meticulously planned by minds that never saw a freezer aisle, but somehow knew how to hack a desert. You imagine the debates now, echoing across time like murmurs in a sandstone hallway. One group insisting it was intentional, another saying it was chance. Meanwhile, Dish just keeps scraping ice, completely uninterested in whether he's a genius or lucky. He's got a yakhchal to fill, and he knows the sun won't wait. The layout of these basins wasn't random, by the way. They were usually placed near walls or low earthen ridges that cast shadows and minimized wind disruption, because even a light breeze could mess with the freeze. The surface tension of the water, the angle of the sun, the time of night, each one mattered. It was desert chemistry, performed in silence, with no lab coats or beakers, just intuition and sand-smoothed clay. You reach down now and run your fingers along the edge of one of these basins. It's dry now, of course, cracked a little, but you can almost feel the smoothness of its old, cool surface. Imagine the hush that settled over the place as the stars came out, and the water began to stiffen. No buzz of power lines, no backup generator hum, just the stillness of starlight coaxing water into crystals. And if you listen hard enough, lean in just a little, you can almost hear the soft crackle of the forming ice. It sounds a little like whispering silk, a little like crushed sugar. It sounds like waiting. During festivals or harvest time, it's said that some of the ice from these basins was crushed and mixed with grape must, fruit syrups, or rose water, a kind of proto-sorbet, possibly served in shallow bowls with spoons carved from horn. Can't you see it? A family gathered under the desert moon, each person savoring a spoonful of something cold and sweet, feeling very fancy indeed. You stand now, brushing phantom frost from your fingertips, and continue walking. The sun has risen a little higher, and you squint into its pale gold. The freezing basins fade behind you, their mystery now yours to carry. Somewhere up ahead, there's a breeze, maybe even a tree. You're not sure yet, but you're still walking, still threading the path of ingenuity baked into sun-baked soil. And as your steps carry you forward, you think once again of Dariush, kneeling, scraping, not worried about climate or scholars or ice cream taxonomy, just doing what worked, what preserved, what cooled. Because in a world with no ice cubes, no soda machines, no mini fridges humming in hotel rooms, the ability to make ice was more than just clever. It was revolutionary. You keep moving. The ground is flatter now, and the wind carries a hush with it, as if it knows the next part of your journey is quieter, more architectural than elemental. A few low hills rise in the distance, but here, the landscape stretches calmly, and just ahead, you see what looks like a wall, a very long wall, and another, and another. You're stepping into the geometry of cold. Welcome to the ice walls, not walls made of ice, Don't get your hopes up for a frosty spectacle, but walls built for ice, or more precisely, built for the conditions that make ice possible. This is where Persian ingenuity flirts shamelessly with environmental physics. Long, mud brick walls, often running east to west, created narrow channels of deep shade. At night, these channels became little windless corridors where water could freeze faster. During the day, the walls helped protect the precious ice from sun exposure. They're like anti-greenhouses. Instead of trapping heat, they trap coolness. You run your hand along one of the walls, sun-warmed now, but you can imagine it in winter, casting a long shadow like a careful hand over a sleeping child. Each wall is deceptively simple, built from mud, straw, clay, whatever could be formed into something tall, sturdy, and very slightly smug. Here's your historical fact. The dimensions of these walls were carefully chosen based on latitude and climate. In Yazd, for instance, some were over 2 meters tall, extending for dozens of meters to maximize the freezing zone. They weren't improvised, they were calculated, but with a kind of casual brilliance that didn't need blueprints, just observation and repetition, and a decent grasp of how shadows behave. You pause and take in the wall's length. It doesn't shout for attention, it whispers its usefulness, like a librarian with a secret. And now your quirky bit. This one's pretty fun. Some Persian poets supposedly reference these walls in love poems, comparing the cool relief of shade to the breath of a beloved. Shade as flirtation, ice as metaphor. You didn't see that coming, did you? It's a little poetic detour, sure, but it tells you how deeply this cooling culture penetrated everyday life. People didn't just build these walls, they admired them, they romanticized them. Some probably even gave them names, like Old Chili or Big Cool Greg. Okay, those last two are yours. Of course, as with everything ancient and clever, not everyone agrees on their primary use. Historians still argue whether these shade walls were meant only for ice, or if they doubled as windbreaks for crops or livestock. Some say they were all-purpose cooling corridors. Others insist the alignment was too perfect for anything but refrigeration. Honestly, your bet's on both. Because, let's face it, if you had one trick that could cool milk and keep goats from overheating, wouldn't you use it twice? You imagine life unfolding in the spaces between these walls. A woman with a brass pot, carefully pouring water into the basin. A boy chasing his shadow. A stray cat sneaking past, tail high, unimpressed by human cleverness. The walls unbothered, just doing their job. You turn the corner and see where two walls converge. There's a little nook, half intentional, half accident. Someone might have used it as a pantry, or a seat, maybe both. The air here is surprisingly still and cool, not ice cream parlor cool, more like library basement cool, the kind of place where secrets settle in and wait patiently. And now, a callback. Remember the yakhchals? Some of them had these exact wall structures built nearby to create a pre-chilled zone where ice would wait before being transferred, like a staging area for frozen logistics. You can picture the system now, the qanats delivering water, the basins freezing it, the walls keeping it undisturbed, and the yakhchal receiving it like a proud, slightly frosty grandmother. You take a seat in that shady corner and lean back. A lizard darts by, The wall's texture is rough beneath your fingertips, but solid, enduring. These bricks were made by hands that understood waiting, understood sun, understood shade. You try to do the same. Above you, the sky is an uninterrupted sheet of blue, but you're not sweating. The walls have taken care of that. In their own way, they're still working, still casting shadows, still whispering to the air. Stay cool, stay calm. And maybe that's the real genius of these walls. Not that they froze anything, but that they created the conditions for freezing to happen. Which, now that you think about it, is basically the definition of being a good host. Just set the mood and let the transformation occur. So you stand again, stretch, and give the wall a silent thank you. It doesn't reply, obviously, but somehow you feel understood. And as you walk on, the path narrows slightly, and you begin to feel the pull of what comes next. You're heading toward the edge of town, where cold becomes commerce, where freezing becomes flaunting. But for now, you walk between two ancient lines of brick and time, shaded and still. You've walked into the oldest kind of technology, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. It just works. You keep to the path as the last of the shade walls taper off behind you, their silhouettes gradually blending into the hazy backdrop of sunlit dust and amber-colored hills. The ground feels different underfoot now, firmer, almost stamped down with intent. And ahead, well, now you're entering the part of the journey where ice becomes currency. Welcome to the ice economy. You wouldn't think something as humble as frozen water would have had an entire infrastructure surrounding it. But then again, you also wouldn't think people could make said ice in a desert. So really, expectations are already on thin ice. Here, in ancient Persia, ice wasn't just a delightful luxury. It was a seasonal commodity. It got harvested, stored, distributed, and, sold. That frozen sheet formed in a shaded basin wasn't just for admiring. It was money. It had roots, guards, quotas, even the occasional scam artist who maybe didn't deliver as many chunks of ice to the village elders as he claimed. We're looking at you, Ibrahim, the suddenly wealthy goat herder. So let's dive in, gently, like a sunburned merchant, hoping to avoid frostbite. Your historical fact. In several Persian cities, especially Yazd and Kerman, ice harvesting was an organized community event. Teams would cut sheets of frozen water at night during the coldest winter weeks and carry them in slabs to storage domes or directly into yakhchals. There were even designated ice masters, people who understood exactly how thick a sheet should be, how long it could sit before cracking, and how to divide it cleanly using nothing but a wooden wedge, a mallet, and probably some quiet swearing. Now, a quirky twist for you. There are oral traditions, especially in rural villages, that ice cutting involved singing. Yep, actual chants in rhythm while breaking and carrying the slabs. Think of it like an ancient DJ Khaled anthem, but for desert refrigeration. The songs weren't just for morale. They helped teams keep pace. Also, some villagers believed certain melodies could charm the ice into staying colder longer. Who knew ice was so emotionally sensitive? But don't get too swept away. There's some academic bickering to cool things down. Historians still argue whether the Persian ice trade was truly profit-driven, or if it was more of a public good, run communally and shared equally. Some evidence points to wealthier citizens paying for extra ice shipments during summer, even bribing keepers to skip the line. Other sources say yakhchal ice was distributed according to need, with elders and sick people prioritized. Maybe it was both, free enough for the people, profitable enough for the power players. Or maybe no one really knew what was fair, but everyone agreed that lukewarm goat milk was unacceptable. You pass by what would have once been a trade station. It's long gone, of course, reduced to a low cluster of half-walls and dusty potsherds. But you can imagine it, the bustle of carts, the slap of camel hooves on packed earth, kids running errands, and merchants calling out deals. Ice wrapped in straw, bundled into baskets, covered with cloth to delay melting, traded for salt, grain, dates, whatever you had that didn't disappear in the sun. Here's a mental image for you. Picture a merchant riding through the desert with a single block of ice tucked in a leather-lined chest. He's got one job, get it from the yakhchal to the palace. No stops, no shade. And he's doing this with a wagon wheel that absolutely squeaks like a dying seagull. The stakes: an irritated noblewoman with a taste for chilled sherbet. Honestly, I wouldn't want to be that guy either. And speaking of sherbet, that's right, the icy drink, not the fizzy candy from corner stores. This is where coldness found its way into royal pleasure. Icy treats made with rose water, fruit juice, and occasionally a questionable spice blend that probably made your eyebrows sweat. High society sipped them beneath shady courtyards, while commoners hoped to lick the melting runoff from a communal clay bowl. The class divide. Chilly. Back to your stroll. You're noticing something curious now. As you walk, the terrain gently dips, and small mounds begin to appear, almost rhythmic, not natural, not graves. These were once insulation pits, dugout stations where ice could be temporarily buried under straw and ash, sort of like the antique version of a freezer truck, minus the truck and electricity and everything else. Remember the wall you sat under earlier? Those walls often led straight to these pits. The idea was simple. Freeze water in the shallow channels, break it into chunks, carry it just a few meters, and bury it. Wait for sunrise, and voila, less melted, more preserved. Rinse, repeat. You reach one now. It's nothing but a low depression in the sand, lined with ancient bricks poking out like bad teeth. You crouch down and feel around, still dry, still insulated, still a little bit magical. You look up and imagine a line of workers, bent backs, woolen cloaks, hands calloused from cold. Some of them kids, some of them old. Ice work didn't discriminate. If you could carry, you were hired. But don't feel too bad. It wasn't all toil and frostbite. Some harvest festivals centered around the first successful freeze. People brought lanterns. There were songs, dancing, and, legend says, at least one drunken uncle who tried to slide across the freezing basin and broke a toe. You'll be shocked to learn that tradition did not continue. So here you are, surrounded by the skeletons of commerce, the forgotten arteries of a cold trade that ran through burning lands. Ice wasn't just stored. It moved. It breathed. It bought favors and healed fevers. You take a deep breath, and the air tastes faintly metallic, like old water and sun-warmed clay. There's a kind of pride here, not the pride of empires or monuments, but the quiet satisfaction of solving a hard problem really, really well. As you rise and brush off your hands, you can feel the next chapter calling. Ahead lie the homes and hearths where this ancient ice finally arrived, where was used, ritually, practically, occasionally, indulgently, but always with awe, because nothing says civilization quite like finding a way to serve ice in the desert. You follow a thin, wavering path now, where the sand takes on a grayer hue, and tufts of stubborn grass poke up like they're trying to convince the desert they belong here. You've left the trade stations behind, and in their place rise signs of human life. At least, what's left of it. Clay homes, long crumbled, cluster like forgotten thoughts, their walls hinting at inner courtyards once shaded and cool. This is where the ice ended up, not just in palaces, but in real homes. For cooking, for medicine, for the simple luxury of feeling a drop of cold against your skin. It's easy to romanticize ancient life from a distance, but don't be fooled. People were people, and while some families used ice to chill water or preserve butter for a day or two, others hoarded it for showing off. Oh, your cousin's wedding had warm wine. Tragic. Ours had icy rose milk. Social flexing. The oldest art form. Let's land our historical fact. In many Persian households, especially in wealthier or highland towns, ice was used during childbirth. Midwives wrapped fragments in cloth and pressed them against the wrists and ankles of laboring mothers. It was believed to reduce swelling, calm nerves, and in some cases, draw the fire out. Whether or not that worked, the gesture alone feels quietly powerful. Even today, an ice pack is still a comfort object in the right moment. And here's your quirky tidbit. In Yezd and parts of Fars province, elders swore by a dessert involving ice, crushed lentils, and a little bit of mulberry syrup. No, you're not dreaming. Crushed lentils. The textures, questionable. The taste, acquired, might be too generous, but people devoured it, especially on Nowruz, the Persian New Year. Some even claimed it had healing properties, mostly the kind that cured bad attitudes in grumpy children. But as you pass what was once a communal gathering area, maybe even a water court, you start to wonder, how did people actually store their precious ice at home? Those yakhchals were great, sure, but they weren't exactly a household item. Did everyone just eat their ice on site? Well, historians still argue whether smaller private ice storage methods ever existed. Some archaeologists think households had mini cellars with thick walls and double doors. Others insist only shared community yakhchals or underground channels could have preserved ice beyond a few days. A few researchers even propose that people wrapped ice in salt-lined goat hide and buried it beneath beds, which, frankly, sounds like a risky move if you own a dog. You're stepping now into one of those homes. You can feel it. This one belonged to someone who had means. The walls are higher and there's still a stub of a column standing in the center courtyard. It's cooler here. Quiet. Maybe there was a shallow fountain once, fed by melted ice or stored water. You picture someone kneeling by it, dipping a cloth in cold water to press against their neck. Relief in the form of evaporation. And over there, see that recess in the wall? It might have held a jar or maybe a skin of rose water chilled with an ice shard, ready to splash on guests' hands. Hospitality ran deep in Persian culture. You didn't just greet people with tea. You cooled the room if you could. A puff of shade, a trickle of water, a bowl of cold cucumbers. It was about dignity, grace, and yes, maybe some light class performance. You're halfway through the home when something catches your eye. Faint burn marks on a clay shelf. an old hearth, which brings us to a surprising reality. Cold wasn't just a luxury, it was a tool. In medicine, ice had multiple uses. Fevers, toothaches, rashes, all received some cold treatment when available. Healers mixed ice with herbs like basil or dried saffron and made pastes or cooling tonics. 1. 10th century Persian text, only partially preserved, describes a syrup of blue lily and night-cooled snow used to lower body heat and reopen the dream paths. Not FDA approved, but undeniably poetic. The courtyard is wider than you expected, and you imagine neighbors gathering here, each with a small chunk of ice wrapped in cloth, sharing stories and recipes. The air is dry, but the shade makes it manageable. It's a perfect place for gossip, which brings us to another fringe element, Persian love letters. Yes, that's where we're going. Some ancient love poems describe not just burning passion, but the coolness of longing. One note from the 5th century BCE compares a lover's breath to wind passing over late ice, and another laments, "Your absence warms my cheeks, yet the ice you left behind still rests in my palm." Metaphor, yes, but also possibly literal. A poetic reminder sent along with a rapidly melting love token. You exit the house, stepping lightly down a slope of what was probably once polished stone. Out here, the hum of desert insects rises, and you squint at the shimmering edge of what used to be a seasonal canal. In the spring it brought water, and maybe, just maybe, melting ice runoff to the gardens and herb beds beyond. The entire infrastructure is humming with subtle genius. These weren't just homes. They were climate-controlled living spaces, centuries before insulation foam or smart thermostats. The people here understood flow of water, air, shade, and yes, ice. And here's something delightful. Some families, particularly in southern towns, froze small toys or lucky charms into their ice blocks before a feast. Children would wait, sticky-fingered, for the melt to reveal the prize, like Kinder eggs, except significantly colder and more likely to result in frostbitten fingers. So now you've seen the whole life cycle of ancient Persian ice, from basin to yakhchal to bustling market, to the quiet, reverent hands of everyday people. In the middle of one of the hottest regions on Earth, they didn't just make cold work. They made it essential, personal, even intimate. You pause before moving on, letting your eyes linger on the jagged line of a broken storage jar. It once held something precious, cooled by something impossibly rare. And tomorrow, someone would rise before dawn, wrap their robe tighter, and head toward the walls and shadows, ready to start the process all over again. You move away from the shadow of the ruined home, the sand growing soft again under your steps. The path bends slightly uphill now, and you feel the air grow warmer, thinner. More of that desert hush returning. You're entering a district that once supported the infrastructure, not the glamorous part of the story. No banquet tables or poetry here, just the unsung logistics. And we're talking about one of the most brilliant, most overlooked systems in ancient Persia, the qanats. A qanat isn't flashy. It's not a towering ziggurat or a royal tomb, but it might be the single reason that any of this, ice, irrigation, even city life, was possible. In the most basic terms, a qanat is a gently sloped underground tunnel that transports water from an aquifer in the mountains to settlements miles away. but that's like saying a modern fridge just keeps food cold. It wildly undersells the miracle. The ancient Persians were building qanats as early as 1000 BCE. These weren't just ditches. They required engineering skills that most of us couldn't fake on a YouTube tutorial. The slope had to be precise, not too steep or the water would rush and erode, not too flat or it wouldn't flow. Just the right gradient, maintained for dozens of miles in some cases. And they did this with basic tools, probably a lot of rope, and more patience than most of us could manage in a Starbucks line. But here's your mainstream fact. Some qanats are still functioning today, over 2 millennia later. Engineers in modern Iran sometimes refer to them not as old infrastructure, but as eternal veins, which is both poetic and, when you think about it, deeply reassuring. Because while empires rise and fall, a well-dug water tunnel, that's forever. And now you're a fringe tidbit, because of course there's a weird detail buried in the dirt. In a few regions, laborers who worked on the qanata wore copper rings around their ankles. Not for punishment. These weren't shackles, but for grounding. People believed that digging so deep underground disrupted your body's natural energies, so the copper would protect you from spiritual dislocation. One old legend claimed that if a worker removed the ring before surfacing, he might never find his way home again, like some kind of earthbound ghost, doomed to wander irrigation tunnels. Frankly, a horror movie waiting to happen. But not everything about the qanat system was mysterious. It had rules. Maintenance teams were organized in shifts, usually starting before dawn. They used a combination of chalk, pebbles, and echoes to measure distances in the dark. And because the tunnels were narrow and sometimes just wide enough for one person, workers sang to each other. Not elaborate songs, mostly short, rhythmic verses about tools, water, and morning light. But they echoed down the shafts in a way that helped everyone keep track of each other. Sort of like Spotify for subterranean survival. Now, historians still argue whether ice transport directly relied on qanats. There's a lot of conjecture around whether the underground system was used only for water or also for temperature-controlled routes. Some argue that long-distance ice movement involved burying it in qanat-adjacent storage pits along the way, keeping it cool as it traveled from highlands to lowlands. Others say that's wishful thinking, and the distances were too great. Either way, the fact that there's even debate about using tunnels to move ice through the desert tells you something about the level of ancient ingenuity here. You're walking now along the remains of what would have been a maintenance hatch, a shallow dome with a narrow hole in the center. These access points dot the landscape like forgotten chimneys. The air rising out of them was often cooler, even in midsummer, and some people claim you could place a ceramic jug over the opening and it would chill the contents inside. Primitive refrigeration, or maybe just wishful thinking. We may never know. But here's something fun. Some of these shafts, when cleaned out, create an eerie whistling as wind moves through the tunnel system below. Kids in nearby villages sometimes called them the singing mouths of the earth, and more than one traveler probably had their hair stand on end when a cheerful ghost song came drifting up from the dirt. You crouch by the hatch, the stone warm beneath your hand, and imagine the sheer effort that went into these networks. Not for glory, not for gods, just so someone could drink cool water. Maybe press ice to a feverish forehead. Maybe, if you were lucky, mix it into a syrup and sip it under a fig tree while pretending you aren't sweating through your robe. and not everyone was convinced these tunnels were entirely natural. In some fringe texts, written centuries later, there are hints that the first qanats were whispered into existence by jinn, supernatural desert beings known for their tricks and mood swings. One version has the jinn teaching a farmer how to slice the earth like fruit to reach water. Another claims a cursed city buried its rivers out of shame, and the qanats were how they wept underground. You probably won't find that version in a museum placard. Still, even without mystical meddling, the ingenuity stands. Imagine digging through rock and sand, day after day, just to bring cold water to people miles away. No shortcuts, no electric pumps, just gravity, mathematics, and sweat. It's a kind of stubborn genius that we almost don't deserve. As the sun starts to dip again, you rise from the qanat shaft and brush the sand from your palms. The breeze is rising, dry and a little bitter, and somewhere in the distance, the hills where the water began are turning a faint lavender. A few birds circle overhead, tiny, determined dots, and you wonder if they too follow the hidden lines of the qanats when they travel. You step back onto the trail, the hum of ancient engineering now a silent echo beneath your feet. Somewhere down there, water still trickles in its stone cradle, cool and persistent, and someone, hundreds of years ago, probably sat in this same spot, wiped the sweat from their brow, took a sip of something sweet and cold, and called it a good day. The sky is darkening now, stars beginning to sprinkle the canvas above you like slow-falling sugar grains. You follow the path gently curving downhill, the air noticeably cooler, not cold, just whisper fresh, as if something ancient is exhaling from the earth itself. You're heading toward one of the last surviving walls of a true Persian yakhchal. This is where the magic of ancient refrigeration reached its silent, domed crescendo. A yakhchal, literally ice pit, looks like a beehive crossed with a spaceship. A giant mud brick dome rising awkwardly from the desert floor. But the real action happened underground. Below this humble dome was a deep, circular pit. Think 10 to 15 meters down. The interior stayed cool, not just because of shade or luck, but because it was designed to breathe in the cold and exhale the heat. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Yakhchals were constructed with a special mortar made of sand, clay, egg whites, goat hair, lime, and ash. That mix created a waterproof and insulative material so effective that modern engineers still study it. The walls were thick, sometimes more than 2 meters, and they kept internal temperatures below freezing, even as the desert sweltered outside. Now, let's shift to something quirkier. One recovered yakhchal site had mysterious carvings etched inside, hidden just below the rim of the dome. Little symbols, nothing majestic or imperial, more like doodles. Some resemble animals, others look like weird spirals or repeated handprints. Were they bored workers marking time? Ritual symbols meant to bless the ice? No one knows for sure. One theory says they were tally marks tracking ice patches. Another suggests they were a kind of low-tech graffiti. Jamal was here, 522 BCE. The whole structure operated on a simple principle. Trap winter cold, then hoard it like a dragon. In colder months, canals diverted water into shaded basins. Overnight, the water would freeze, and workers would carefully haul the ice into the pit before dawn. layer upon layer, with insulating straw in between. And once the dome was sealed, the cold was locked in for months. Historians still argue whether yakhchals were public infrastructure or controlled by elites. Some texts hint they were part of palace complexes, used for storing elite luxuries, like chilled pomegranate juice or medicinal snow. Others say every neighborhood had a small-scale version, almost like a communal fridge. It's possible both are true, depending on the city or era. There might have been grand imperial yakhchals, staffed, guarded, and full of ceremonial desserts, and smaller, rougher cousins, where your average goat herder stored his wife's yogurt. You run your hand along the cracked wall of the dome. Even in ruin, it breathes cold. There's a musty mineral scent, like wet stone and old clay. You lean over and peer into the shadowy pit. It's dark down there, but you imagine it filled with shimmering blocks wrapped in straw, resting like winter's bones. There's one yakhchal legend that stands out among the rest. It's fringe, even by bedtime history standards. Supposedly one dome was cursed, not haunted, not hexed, just doomed to stay warm. No matter how many blocks were stored inside, the temperature refused to drop. Workers tried everything, changing the straw, changing the floor, praying at the door. Nothing worked. Eventually, they bricked it up and walked away. The story ends with a line that gives you a little chill. The cold would not stay because it was not invited. Charming, right? It's probably just a metaphor for bad insulation. But still, creepy. Back in reality, archaeologists discovered some bits with residue from what looked like flavored ice, fruit mixed with snow, probably pomegranate or quince. It's believed that the ancient Persians may have been among the first to invent a sort of proto-sorbet. And if you've ever had a bitter day, just picture some dusty administrator in 500 BCE sulking on a clay bench, spooning chilled rosewater ice into his face while muttering about tax quotas. Dessert, it turns out, is eternal. And it wasn't just food. Medicinal uses were huge. Compresses made from yakhchal ice were applied to swollen joints and fevers. Some priests even used it in rituals, purifying objects with sacred cold. And here's a slightly gross but still fascinating tidbit. Some records describe women in labor being given chilled cloths during birth. Not a perfect hospital by modern standards, but not exactly primitive either. You circle the dome slowly, toes brushing past forgotten pottery shards. Some still shine in the moonlight, little curved glints that once held snow, maybe, or sherbet, or just plain water, liquid survival wrapped in earthen elegance. You pause near what was probably an entry tunnel, just a low, collapsed arch now. But in its day, it funneled warm air away while colder air sank into the pit. Passive ventilation. Thousands of years before smart homes made it trendy. There's a spot nearby where you sit back against a broken column. The stars are fully out now, bright and sharp. You close your eyes and imagine the work crews moving before dawn, stacking ice with rhythmic care, whispering jokes, maybe complaining about their sandals, maybe singing, and still, somewhere underground, below layers of dust and memory, the earth remembers how to stay cool. You exhale, so much cleverness buried in silence. You stir slightly, shifting your weight on the smooth, worn rock, and the scent of dry clay and cool earth lingers in the air like a faint exhale from another century. The yakhchal behind you looms like a silent giant, its secrets mostly safe, though you've managed to coax a few out tonight. Your journey continues now, not deeper underground, but further across the sandy expanse to the humble lives orbiting these icy domes. Because what good is ice in the desert unless someone uses it? You trudge along a trail likely walked by thousands before you. Barefoot shepherds, jug-carrying children, and bleary-eyed ice haulers with backs stronger than your Wi-Fi signal. Their job was more than just sweaty labor. They were essential nodes in a system that brought luxury to royal courts and relief to sun-beaten villages alike. Without them, the yakhchal was just an empty dome. One mainstream historical fact stands out here. The transportation of ice from yakhchals to cities wasn't done randomly. Ancient Persians developed logistical systems involving relays of camels and mules, often traveling at night. These nocturnal supply chains helped maintain the cold temperature of the precious cargo. Some routes were even shaded artificially with woven mats strung between poles, an ancient Persian version of climate-controlled delivery. And here's your quirky fringe tidbit. One old tale suggests that some ice deliverers chewed specific dessert herbs that cooled the breath and masked body odor, not because they were picky about freshness, but because nobles receiving the ice didn't want it tainted by the scent of man. Historians are still skeptical whether this was real or just poetic snobbery, but the urban question, galbanum, does appear in other ancient Persian recipes, for incense, perfume, and oddly enough, toothpaste. You reach a small cluster of low, half-crumbling ruins. These were likely once the quarters of those delivery crews. No gold trimmings or monumental inscriptions here, just practicality. Narrow doorways to keep the heat out. Clay shelves molded into the walls. A hearth at the center, still blackened from use. You touch a spot where fingers wore down the edge of a niche, maybe reaching for a bowl of cool yogurt or an oil lamp before setting out on a midnight haul. These were the hands that made ancient cooling work, the invisible network behind what you'd call today a supply chain, except this one didn't have barcodes or strike threats, just worn sandals and impeccable timing. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Historians still argue whether the distribution of ice was a paid service, a religious duty, or a blend of both. Some records suggest temple complexes helped organize the deliveries, possibly linking the cold cargo to purity rituals. Others describe it more like a state-run utility, delivering coolness to those who paid a seasonal tax or fee. One particularly juicy clay tablet implies that an angry merchant once tried to sue an ice runner for delivering slush. The details are fuzzy, but let's assume his gelato was ruined and move on. But it wasn't all solemn processions and ancient complaints. Some communities turned the arrival of ice into small celebrations. Think of it like ice cream truck energy, but with more goats and fewer jingles. Children would crowd around, hoping for a sliver. Priests might sprinkle a few shards into ceremonial basins. And of course, the nobility would retreat indoors with goblets of chilled grape must, fanning themselves dramatically as if they'd done anything other than lounge all day. And now a joke floats into your head, soft and dry like the wind itself. What do you call a royal who complains that the ice is melting too fast? A drip. You chuckle to yourself, maybe a little too much. As you wander further into the ruins, you find one structure still half standing. The back wall curves in a familiar shape, almost yakhchal-like but smaller. A mini storage dome, or perhaps the personal stash of a wealthy household. Inside, the temperature is noticeably cooler. You sit on a slab that may have once supported a storage urn. There are grooves in the floor for drainage and 2 small vents cut into the upper walls. The passive cooling design was used at all scales, not just in giant domes. Even wealthier homes had their own micro yakhchals, status symbols with practical flair. You hear rustling behind you, just a breeze, or a desert fox, if you want to get dramatic. You lean back and stare at the vent, the starlight barely visible through its slanted cut. Somewhere above this same structure, 2,000 years ago, someone likely stared through the same hole, wondering if the ice delivery was late or melted, or both. The Persian mastery of passive refrigeration didn't just sit in domes and domed brains. It rippled through the culture, from peasant coolers to royal sherbet chalices. And while some of that knowledge faded, echoes of it can still be found in certain Iranian desert towns today, where a few ancient yakhchals remain in use, or at least reverently intact. One even has a plaque out front now, probably installed by someone wearing a lanyard and nodding seriously. In truth, the reason this system worked so well wasn't just because of genius architecture or clever chemistry. It was because of the people. The unnoticed, sun-drenched laborers who ran coolness through the hottest corners of a harsh land, one icy brick at a time. And as you sit here, cooled by the breath of a long-dead system still managing to do its job, you can't help but admire that quiet, resilient genius. You rise slowly from the cool stone ledge, brushing imaginary dust from your pants. Because let's be honest, everything here is already coated in the fine, talc-like powder of centuries. The desert has a way of exfoliating you whether you want it to or not. Your path now veers away from the human hands that maintained these icy wonders and toward the atmosphere itself. Tonight, or rather some 2,000 years ago tonight, was not just about buildings or labor. It was about air. The Persian ice stream depended on a single ingredient no blueprint could control: the sky. The Persian engineers were masters of passive cooling, not just because they built well, but because they built with the climate. One mainstream historical fact here is that most yakhchals were aligned with prevailing wind patterns, especially the shomal, a dry northerly breeze that still teases Iran's central deserts today. These winds fed through tall structures called badjirs, or wind catchers, which funneled and chilled air into underground chambers. Think of them like nature's own air conditioning towers, minus the hum and the terrifying electric bill. But the true genius was how they paired these wind catchers with the yakhchal's dome. The rounded top didn't just look good on a postcard. It helped create pressure differentials, drawing warm air upward and away from the storage areas below. It's not just clever. It's physics you slept through in school, now making a cameo as you doze off again. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. Some ancient Persian architects supposedly trained birds, yes, actual desert birds, to nest near these wind catchers. The theory was that their wings flapping at certain times of day encouraged airflow. Historians still argue whether this was a real system or a poetic exaggeration. One ancient text even claims a local mayor offered gold coins for any dove that nested above the north-facing vent. Whether or not the doves accepted the deal is unclear. This open scholarly debate threads into a broader question. Did wind catchers always work, or did they function best only in specific microclimates? Some sites suggest brilliant performance. Others show bafflingly bad airflow, as if someone installed the vents backward. There's even a theory that some wind catchers were ceremonial, not functional. Essentially ancient HVAC placebo. Still, when they did work, they worked beautifully. A night breeze could slide through the wind catcher, curl its way around the conical pit of the yakhchal, and slow dance over the ice bricks below. Temperatures inside dropped so much that entering one barefoot on a summer day was described as stepping into a winter cave. Imagine the shock, blazing sun outside, a cold breath of winter inside, and all of it powered by nothing but stone, shadow, and the breath of the wind. You imagine someone standing at the edge of one of these domes, adjusting a vent flap made of woven reed or goat leather, just trying to get the angle right, like a sleepy DJ tuning frequencies between mild breeze and sandstorm. Somewhere below, a family prepares to use the ice for a feast, the matriarch holding a bowl of syrupy pomegranate concentrate, ready to drizzle it over frozen goat's milk. You can almost hear the crackle as the ice hits the ceramic. Wind wasn't the only friend of the Persian freezer. They also mastered the art of radiant cooling, the process where exposed surfaces release heat to the sky at night, especially under clear, dry conditions. Some early yakhchals incorporated shallow pools beside their base. These pools, filled after sundown, would freeze overnight as they radiated heat away into the chilly sky. Come morning, voila, thin sheets of ice harvested before breakfast. Take that, electric ice maker. You pause to rest beside the ruins of one such pool, the shallow depression still evident in the moonlight. A few hardy weeds sprout in the cracks, tenacious survivors clinging to ancient concrete. You dip your fingers in imaginary water, feel the phantom chill, and because your brain insists on it, what's a windcatcher's favorite song? Blowin' in the Wind. Obviously. Thank you, Bob Dylan, for the eternal air quality anthem. As the breeze stirs your hair now, real or imagined, you get the eerie feeling of standing not just in the footprint of history, but in its breath. These systems didn't require roaring furnaces or clanking gears. They just needed patience, geometry, wind, the long game. And so the Persians played it well. Better, in fact, than many later societies who would waste centuries trying to outmuscle nature instead of partnering with it. The windcatchers didn't fight the heat, they danced with it. Historians still puzzle over how far this technology traveled. Some say windcatchers made it as far as Egypt, or even parts of the Arabian Peninsula, where similar vents appear on later buildings. Others argue it was homegrown, rooted specifically in the Persian plateau's climate and philosophy. Some archaeologists suggest that early yakhchal blueprints were passed down like sacred recipes, father to son, apprentice to master mason, with adjustments made through whispered advice and calloused fingertips. Tonight, you're heir to that whisper. You reach a point where the windcatcher's silhouette rises behind you like a giant fan blade stuck in the desert floor. The opening at the top stares blankly into the stars. You wonder if, 2,000 years ago, a builder stood on that same spot, turning his face into the breeze and deciding, yes, this is where we make the ice breathe. And somewhere in your mind, just before sleep knocks, you hear it. The faint, whirring whisper of desert air sliding down stone. An ancient lullaby of heat and cool, work and wind, fire and ice. You slide farther along the dust-swept trail now, stepping lightly as if not to wake the ghosts of builders, merchants, and camel drivers who once passed this way. The yakhchals behind you are slowly fading into the dunes, their pale domes barely rising above the horizon, like the shells of ancient desert turtles, silent, steady, and absurdly efficient. But as your path veers left, you catch sight of something else. A long-abandoned market square, or at least what's left of one. Stone foundations outline where shops once stood, and at the very center, a low circular depression marks a communal gathering space. Not for speeches or dancing. No, this was for ice. Because the true magic of Persian ice making wasn't just in storing frozen water. It was in sharing it. Tonight, you follow the ice on its journey out of the yakhchal and into the beating heart of everyday life. One mainstream historical fact is this. In many towns, ice wasn't a luxury hoarded by the elite. It was distributed through carefully regulated system. Local leaders often oversaw its use, rationing it in hotter months, tracking it during famines, and ensuring temples, hospitals, and travelers had fair access. Persian engineers were not just technologists. They were community planners. Now, the quirky tidbit. Ice blocks were sometimes delivered via camel in insulated saddlebags made of thick wool and clay-stuffed hides. These were essentially ancient cooler bags, and rumor has it that camels tasked with ice duty were pampered more than others, receiving softer bedding and special treats. One legend even claims a certain ice camel named Dariush was buried with a wreath of mint tied around his neck, both for honor and, perhaps, to mask the scent. As you imagine this chill-carrying camel train winding across the desert, it's hard not to chuckle. 1,000 years before gelato delivery scooters in Rome, there were camels with cooler packs, trudging through heat waves to bring sweet relief to sunburnt townsfolk. But here's where things get foggy, literally and figuratively. Historians still argue whether ice distribution was a regular part of Persian life, or more of an elite seasonal event. Some texts suggest daily deliveries, while others hint that common folk only got ice during religious festivals or royal visits. A few even say that most people didn't use the ice directly. They used the coolness stored in the walls of underground food cellars lined with it, never seeing the frozen blocks themselves. So was Persian ice public good, or palatial perk? The debate lingers like a warm breeze over a frosted bowl of rosewater sorbet. You pause near a sunken storeroom, its stairs leading downward to where barrels of dairy, pickles, and wine might have once rested in the cool. A merchant in a linen tunic would have known exactly how much ice to haul in to keep his yogurt from turning to soup. You picture him squinting at a ledger, perhaps mumbling to himself about rising brine costs and his lazy nephew who let the last block melt completely. Every age has its interns. And speaking of interns, did you know that some apprentices were tested by their ability to chip ice cleanly without cracking the blocks? It wasn't just about strength. It was finesse. A bad cut could cause the ice to fracture or melt faster. You'd be standing in the sun, holding a jagged chunk of shame, while your instructor sighed dramatically in the background. Middle school gym teachers didn't invent disappointment. They just inherited it. The marketplaces were where science met drama. Ice brought with it not just temperature change, but cultural temperature too. Vendors sold chilled drinks made with mulberries, tamarind, or basil seeds. Medicinal practitioners used ice to soothe fevers or reduce inflammation, sometimes placing cold stones in cloth pouches to be worn on the wrists or forehead. Lovers, poets, and tea sellers gathered near ice wells, weaving their work into the cool air, melting hearts, perhaps, faster than the ice. And yet, all this depended on one simple rule: don't waste it. Entire sections of cities were built to minimize ice exposure. Shaded corridors, sunken alleys, and wind-blocking walls all conspired to keep temperatures just a bit lower, just long enough. Builders even designed special urns, thick-walled ceramic pots with narrow necks, to preserve fragments of ice longer. If you cracked one open mid-July, it might still contain a shard small enough to chill your palm. It's easy to forget, in a world where a fridge light flickers on when you open a door, just how delicate and precious coldness used to be. Every degree mattered. Every drop lost was a potential spoonful of yogurt gone sour, or a medical treatment ruined. As you drift now past the last ruins of the market square, the stones still warm from the sun, you feel the tension between luxury and necessity that surrounded these blocks of ice. To us, it seems quaint. To them, it was vital. In cities where the difference between heat stroke and survival could be a handful of degrees, a chunk of ice could mean everything. The route continues, and you imagine the clink of tongs on clay, the laughter of a child surprised by the cold, the slap of a wet cloth as it's wrapped around a sliver of frost. Perhaps someone in a distant alley offers a cup of something chilled, thick with pomegranate syrup and goat milk, spiced with a hint of saffron, priced just high enough to sting a little. And you think, if time machines ever became real, skip the wars and palaces. Just visit one of these markets on a summer afternoon, buy yourself a drink, and sit in the shade with the ice camels. You move forward, slower now, as if your footsteps are padded in felt. The desert grows quieter, and the color of the sky above fades into that indistinct blue-gray haze that only comes with twilight on the edge of nowhere. The wind carries with it the memory of every block of ice that ever clinked into a clay jar, and somewhere beneath your feet, ancient engineers smile behind their beards, because you've finally arrived, not at a palace or a ruined caravanserai, but at a hollowed basin half hidden in a cleft between hills. A sinkhole, you think at first, but no. This is something far more specific, far more clever. You're standing at the edge of a qanat, one of the greatest hydrological secrets of ancient Persia. These underground aqueducts channeled water from distant mountains and reservoirs, sloping gently over dozens of kilometers beneath the scorched earth. Invisible from above, protected from evaporation, reliable even in drought. Here's your mainstream fact. The Persians invented qanats over 2,500 years ago, and they still work. Many are still in use in Iran today. These tunnels weren't just a water supply. They were the beating arteries that made storing ice possible. Without a cool, steady trickle of water from beneath the surface, those carefully constructed yakhchals would have simply become giant ovens. And your quirky tidbit? Some qanats had secret entrances used only by a chosen few, usually engineers or priests. These hidden access points weren't just practical, they were considered sacred. Water was life after all, and in a desert, controlling its flow was nearly divine. One legend speaks of a tunnel so long that a goat wandered into its mouth and didn't emerge until 3 days later, confused, hydrated, and mysteriously glowing. Okay, maybe not glowing, but still, 3 days. Scholars, of course, still argue whether ice storage was actually the primary motivation behind building qanats in certain settlements. Some say the ice was just a bonus. Others argue that cooling, not irrigation, was the point in smaller towns built far from farmland. A few even believe that ice production was originally a spiritual ritual tied to purity and seasonal balance, which, to be honest, sounds like something someone would say just to get out of actual digging duty. You slide into the edge of the qanat's exposed slope. It's cool here, noticeably so. You feel the difference immediately, like walking into a cellar or opening a chest freezer after rummaging around in the garage. Your breath seems heavier, your eyelids a little lazier, and there's something hypnotic about the rhythm of water dripping, echoing, and trickling through stone channels just below your toes. In these places, engineers weren't just ditch diggers, they were climate whisperers. They measured slope gradients to within fractions of degrees. They calculated airflow like symphony conductors. And they understood that if you could get water to behave beneath your feet, you could survive anything above them. Sometimes these qanats ended in open basins, places where water gathered briefly before being funneled into homes, gardens, and yakhchals. People came here not just to collect water, but to cool off, gossip, pray, or dunk a melon until it tasted like heaven. You crouch beside one such pool now, dipping a toe in, half expecting it to tingle with ancient wisdom, or maybe just with the cold. It does both. You picture someone like you hundreds of years ago, also crouching here. Maybe they're a delivery runner waiting for the next camel. Maybe they're a father teaching his daughter how to recognize the smell of good clay. Maybe they're an exhausted ice merchant, having just slipped on a wet stone and dropped 3 days' worth of carefully chipped ice, and now sitting there, soaked and muttering curses in Old Persian that roughly translate to frosted fool. Because yes, ice slipped, ice melted, ice cracked, and still they carried on. The system worked because people respected the cold. They respected the quiet planning it took to keep something from melting in a desert. They didn't rely on brute force or magic, just careful design, patient maintenance, and a deep understanding of their land's rhythms. No app, no plug, just stone, slope, and sweat. You wander further now, tracing where a qanat once connected to a distant reservoir. Along the way, small stone wells dot the path, ventilation shafts that doubled as emergency access points. Kids used to dare each other to drop stones down and count the echoes. Occasionally someone dropped something more precious, and a whole day would be spent fashioning a hook from old tools to fish it out. The last stretch of your path is uphill, away from the shadow of the qanat. You pass a hillock where an old yakhchal stands, less domed, more sagging now. But it's still there, still cool inside, even after all these years. You step inside. The walls smell of dust and limescale. The air is dry, still, and dense, like the space between dreams. No ice remains, of course, but the memory lingers. The architecture hums with intention. Every brick was placed by someone who understood that survival didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply waited, in a dome of mud and ash beneath the desert stars, for the right moment to cool your lips. And as your fingers graze the rough inner walls, you think about every block of ice ever stored here, every journey it took, every tongue it chilled, every fever it soothed, Every moment it paused the sun's heat, if only for an hour. We think of ice as fleeting, but here it became legacy. Wind down, you stay a little longer inside the yakhchal. The silence here has a texture, thick like felt, and somehow reassuring. Even the memories seem muffled, folded neatly into the walls. You take a breath, slow and quiet, and you let the last of the warmth from outside slip off your shoulders like an old shawl. There's something comforting about the stillness of ancient design, something kind in the way it was all built, not for glory or show, but for continuity, a humble structure made to hold coolness and comfort in a place where the sun never stopped staring. You imagine the hands that packed mud, that shaped bricks, that aligned tunnels across hills with only stars and string to guide them. And now it's all still, but not empty. Outside the air is cooling too. The night leans in gently, pressing its forehead against the roof of the dome. You can almost hear it sigh. You step out slowly, back into the desert, the kind that only makes noise when you're not trying to listen. Sand, shifting, distant wind wrapping around dry shrubs. Maybe a lizard rustling through a forgotten basket. It doesn't matter what time it is now. Time feels soft, flexible. You could be in 2025 or 425 BCE, and the stones wouldn't care. The design wouldn't care. That ice, imagined and now gone, would still hum its little lullaby from beneath the floor. You blink a little slower. You breathe a little deeper. Your feet are lighter, and your thoughts are more cloud than sentence. That fan you left running is humming now, its rhythm syncing up with the breeze in your memory. A calm, looping echo, like wind in a kanat, like breath in a sleeping chest. And as you rest, may your dreams be cool and smooth. May your thoughts melt like ice in an ancient bowl. And may you wake tomorrow, knowing that even in the driest desert, someone long ago found a way to make the cold last.